What's up guys, this is Nefarious Intent back for part 5 of the 1.8 hacked client coding tutorial. Today, I'm going to be teaching you how to code a main menu and a KillAura. So without further ado, let's open our Eclipse and get right into it.
It is touching the truth.
This series is brought to you by Intent.store. If you're looking to buy a hacked client, check them out first because they have a good selection of premium Minecraft cheats for affordable prices. We're going to start by making our main menu, and this is going to consist of a custom background image and then some buttons and some text. So you need to find your custom background image. It doesn't have to be the one I'm using in the video, obviously. So go on Google Images, go on Photoshop, whatever you need to do, just make a 1920 by 1080 image that we can use as a background. Throughout these tutorials, we haven't really optimized our workspace. So since we don't really need the task list or the outline, I'm going to close those and I'm going to move the package explorer a little bit farther left so we have more space to code. Now, I'm going to right click on UI, new class, and I'm going to call it main menu. And under superclass, I'm going to hit browse and I'm going to type GUI screen and choose the first one and finish. Now we have this empty class that's extending off of GUI screen that we can customize to fulfill our main menu needs. So I'm going to start by indenting and creating a new constructor called public main menu. So when we create a new instance of the main menu, this will be called. We may not necessarily use this, but it's good to have it as a sort of outline. So when we have ideas of how we want to initialize the class, we can implement them here if necessary. Next, I'm going to create a method called public void init GUI. This is called every time we go to the main menu. So if you resize the screen, go from full screen to not full screen, or just visit the main menu from another menu, this will be called. And this is also necessary, you'll see. Next, we want to create another method called public void draw screen. And for the parameters, we want int mouse x, int mouse y, and float partial ticks. We're probably not going to use the partial ticks, but it's just required to inherit the method calls from GUI screen. This is going to be called every time a frame is rendered. So this is where all your drawing is going to take place. Next, we're going to create another method called public void mouse clicked. Also with the parameters mouse x and mouse y. But this time we're going to create, instead of partial ticks, mouse button or just button. And this is going to be what button on our mouse we're actually clicking. So right click, left click, that will all fall under mouse clicked. And lastly, we want to create a method called public void on GUI closed. And this will just be a little routine that we can run every time the GUI is exited, whether you're loading the world screen or multiplayer, or in the future an alt manager, this will be called. So now that we've outlined our main menu, we want to take the image that we found for the background and put it into the assets folder. So we can do this by opening our file explorer, navigating to the src folder, Minecraft, assets, Minecraft, and we create a new folder here called tutorial. You can call it whatever you want. Just make sure as you follow the tutorial, you adjust the name to what you chose. I chose the macOS Big Sur wallpaper. I cropped it to 1080 and I made it a JPEG. JPEGs are optimal for main menu backgrounds because of their size. The PNG version of this would have been 4 megabytes, but this one's not even a whole megabyte. We can start drawing the image by typing mc.getTextureManager.bindTexture, and then we're going to create a new resource location object called the folder we created, so minus tutorial / the image name, background.jpg, and then I'm going to import the resource location. Next, we have to draw the image we just bound. I'm going to type this draw model rect with custom size texture there, and then for the X and Y I'm going to do 0. For the U and V, these are like offsets from the tile, which we're not even using the tile system, so we can just type 0 0 again. For the width and height, we want this to be the screen width, so we're going to type this dot width, this dot height, and then this dot width and this dot height. Now, we have to actually get this main menu in front of your eyeballs. So how we do this is we create a search. We type in GUI main menu and hit search. At the bottom, these are all the results. We can click on one of them and you can see there's an instance of it creating a GUI main menu object. We just want to change this to our main menu and then import it. And we want to go to all the other occurrences and do the same thing. There's not actually that many occurrences, so it's pretty easy. And what this does is it allows us to keep our original main menu intact. So if we want to switch back, or there's some reason why you want to switch back, you'll be able to, and you won't have deleted or modified the original main menu. I'm going to continue changing the occurrences, importing, and we're almost done. This one is going to be one of the tough ones to follow along with, so just make sure you actually do change all the occurrences, because sometimes there's going to be an error that you have to account for, like this. The parameter is expecting the GUI main menu object and it didn't get it. So I just fixed that, and then here, and then we changed the last occurrences, and we can just copy the word main menu and paste it everywhere else and import it. And then when you're done, you want to make another search for the same thing and see if there's any occurrences left. And other than the actual main menu itself, there shouldn't be any occurrences left other than imports, which will be removed when you compile. Now, if we start up our Minecraft, all we should see is our wallpaper. There we go. There's our wallpaper. We can make it full screen, and we have our wallpaper in full screen. But right now, yeah, it's just our wallpaper. So we need to add buttons so we can access the rest of our client. So we can go back to our main menu class and create some new buttons to do what we want. There's a couple ways we can go about this, because at this point it's just up to our creativity. But I have a design in mind that I think you'll like, and I'm just going to do it for the tutorial because it'll probably be the best looking tutorial main menu you've ever seen. So I want to draw a row of buttons on the bottom with a gradient leading up to the center, or maybe the third. So the buttons are sort of highlighted, but we're also not taking away from the main menu background, and then have the title of our client to the upper third, or maybe slightly above the middle. I'm going to start with the gradient by typing this, draw gradient. For the left, I'm going to do 0. For the right, I'm going to do width. For the bottom, I'm going to do height. For the start color, I'm going to do 0x00000000. And for the end color, I'm going to do 0x FF000000. Going back to the top, I'm going to choose something like height minus 100 and see what happens. And as you can see, there's a nice gradient applied. If we comment it out and save, there's no gradient. And if we uncomment it and save, there's a little gradient there. So this is what we're going to put our buttons in front of. Next, I'm going to draw the title of the client by typing this .draw centered string mc.fontRenderObject, and then going to client.name. For the X, I'm going to do width divided by 2, F, 2 float, and for the height, I'm also going to do height divided by 2 float. This basically prevents the rounding up or rounding down that an integer might incur, so this should be a very accurate centering. And for the color, I'm just going to do white, and I believe I have to change the arguments from integer to float to allow that. So I'm going to choose this first recommended code change and then save. When I go back to the main menu, I'm going to have to terminate the application because we changed the parameters or something while it was running, and then save the main menu. Now if I relaunch the client, you see the tutorial text is written really small. I also just realized that the height is not centered, so we need to subtract from this mc.fontRenderObject.fontHeight divided by 2f as well. I save it, and that tutorial text should be perfectly centered. I also want to make the title bigger, so I'm going to use the same strategy we used from our HUD to scale up the logo. So I'm going to copy this first block, paste it in front, and make room there, and then copy the second block, which is just the matrix pop, and put it after. Now, if I saved this, it would do something weird. As you can see, the tutorial text is now in the bottom. So that's because the translate isn't translating to where the text is actually located. So I want to copy this, paste it here for those 2 arguments, and then encircle the next ones in parentheses so I can paste the first width argument here and the height here. And what we should get is centered text but scaled up, and that's indeed what we got. Now I think the tutorial text could actually be a little bit bigger, so I'm going to change the scale from 2 to 3 and see what happens. I also just realized that we don't need to continue this font height shift because that's actually shifting it from the top or bottom instead of the center. We actually just want it to be scaled up from the center of the screen as an anchor point. So if I save that and go back, it's actually more centered than it was a moment ago. So if I go back and unsave, you can see the difference. It went up to be centered. Now I want to create the button list. So these are the different buttons that open the single player menu, the multiplayer menu, settings, those kind of things. So I'm going to, after the gradient rectangle was drawn, create a new string array. So I'm going to call this string array buttons equals, and then for the buttons, I'm going to type single player, multiplayer, settings, language, and quit. Now I'm going to say for the string name out of buttons, I'm going to draw a centered string with the font renderer object, plugging in the name as the string. And then for the X, I'm going to do width divided by buttons.length, and you'll see what I'm gonna do in a minute. And then for the height, I'm gonna do height minus 20 or so. And for color, -1. Now I'm going to create a new integer called count, set to 0. And then every time a name is drawn, we're going to increase that count. And then I'm going to multiply the count to the width and save. And this is what we get. They're not centered at all, but you can see what I'm shooting for. So now it's all a matter of shifting things over. So if I add width divided by buttons.length again and save it, they're moved over too far. So if I encircle these in parentheses and divide by 2 float, what we get is almost centered. So now you can just eyeball it. So I'm gonna shift things over 5 pixels, see how that looks. Maybe 8 pixels. Now we have to make these buttons do something. So that's actually pretty straightforward. All we have to do is copy this statement, place it in mouse clicked. But instead of drawing a string, we wanna check if the mouse is in the boundaries of where the string is being drawn. So I'm going to take the X parameter, and I'm going to create a new variable in here called X, and I'm going to set it equal to that. I'm going to create a Y parameter where I do the same thing. And then I'm going to get rid of the draw string call, and I'm going to make an if statement that says if mouse X is greater than or equal to X, and mouse Y is greater than or equal to Y, and mouse X is less than X plus mc.fontrenderer.getStringWidth name, and mouse Y is less than Y plus mc.fontrenderObject.fontHeight, will do something. But X and Y are not completely correct because we were drawing a centered string. This one starts from center and goes both directions. So for the X coordinate, we need to actually subtract half of the string width. So mc.fontrenderObject.getStringWidth name divide by 2 float. Now this next block of code should be correct. So we want to act on the click based on what name was actually pressed. So we could start a switch case called switch name, with the cases being single player, multiplayer, and the rest of them. Breaking after each case so it doesn't continue on to the next case when it's met with a match. So for single player, we're going to say mc.display GUI screen, new GUI select world, import that, and we need to plug in the current screen, which is as simple as typing this. So single player should work. If I press the button, I go to single player, and if I cancel, I go back. So now I need to handle multiplayer, which is very similar. I just type in the name, so multiplayer, and then instead of GUI select world, we do GUI multiplayer, and we can save and test that as well. For settings, we type GUI options, and we don't only need to plug in our current screen, but we also need to plug in mc.game settings, and we can test that. Boom. For language, we type GUI language, and we also need to add mc.getLanguageManager and import that. That works. And for quit, we just type mc.shutdown. And if we press it, it shuts down. Also, if you want to make the button colors change to our client color when you hover them, that's pretty simple. We just copy this statement from our mouse clicked, place it above the draw centered string. We can actually change this to a boolean hovered equals that, and we can remove the parentheses if we want to. And then in front of the -1, which stands for white, we can say if hovered. So this is what we call an inline if statement or a ternary if statement. So we place our boolean in front of the question mark, then we place the question mark, then we choose what we want it to be if true, and then colon what we want it to be if false. So for the if true, we want to go to our HUD and take that blue color and paste it there. So now if we save and I hover over the buttons, you can see it changes to the blue color when we hover over them. So that's how to make a main menu for your client. Next, we're going to make KillAura. So we're going to open our module packages and copy a simple one like Sprint. Right click modules, create a new package called Combat and paste it in. Then we're going to do the same old thing, which is refactor, change it to KillAura, save, and then change that from Sprint to KillAura. Change it to Combat, and in my case, I'm going to leave the bind as X, and then erase the event update statement and erase what's in on disable and save. Then we'll go to our client, and over here at the end, we'll import KillAura and add that to our module list and start up the client. We're also going to need to create a new event called EventMotion. Allows us to tap into the rotation sent to the server, so we can pretend to be looking at the entity we're attacking with KillAura. So I'm going to copy the event update, paste it back into listeners, but this time call it EventMotion. And then in there, we're going to create some variables: public double X, Y, and Z, public float, yaw and pitch, and public Boolean on ground, and save. Then we're going to create a constructor using fields with Eclipse's code generation feature. We're going to omit the super call, and then we're going to indent. If we want to, we can create some getters and sitters as well with their generation feature. There we go, there's our event. So I'm going to go to entity player SP or single player. It's not really a single player though, it's just your character. I'm going to create a new event called EventMotion event equals new EventMotion, and we're going to import. But instead of just stopping it there, we're going to plug in some things. So we got to plug in our X, Y, and Z coordinates, which you can copy from here. We're going to paste the rest of this as well. So our rotations and our on ground state. So there we go. We're going to set the type to event type pre, and we're going to fire client on event. Down here, all these occurrences of pause X, we're going to change to event X or event.getX. And we can actually just highlight pause X, press Control F, and then copy the block of code here and change to selected lines, and then replace that with getX and hit replace all. And that won't replace all occurrences throughout the class, but just in this selected area. And we can also do the same for pause Z, changing that to event getZ. We can also copy this bounding box minimum Y, which stands for your Y coordinate, and we can also select lines and type event.getY and paste that in there and replace all. And then we need to do the same thing for our rotations. So this dot rotation yaw, change that to get yaw, replace rotation pitch or get pitch, and this dot on ground for event dot is on ground, and then save. Now we can take this little block right here, and at the end, we can say event set type post and call it. Now KillAura is ready to be coded. So we're going to type if e instance of EventMotion and import it. We need to get a target list. KillAura is really a simple operation. It's just taking the entities loaded in the world, filtering them down to the ones you can actually hit, and then attacking them and rotating and doing some timing to make sure it doesn't flag the anti-cheat or hit too fast. So right here, you want to say if E is pre, then continue and open up some space in here because this is what a lot of our code is going to be sitting in. We want to make a list of entity living base called targets. And you want to set it equal to mc.theworld.loaded entity list .stream.filter entity living base .class : is instance, and then collect collectors to list. And if we hit Control-Shift-O, choose the list, and then save, we need to cast this as a list of entity living bases, and there we go. So that's our target list. This is going to include all actual entities like players, animals, and other creatures in the world, but we need to sort of whittle this down to the entities we can actually hit or the ones that we want to hit. So the first thing we want to do is redefine targets. So targets equals targets stream filter, but this time we want to create a local variable to represent the entity in the list. So we're going to say E, and then we're going to type -arrow, and then we're going to say if E dot get distance to entity mc.thePlayer is less than our reach distance, which we'll say is 4 in this case, and E is not equal to mc.thePlayer, collectors to list, and save. Now we'll notice we can't use the actual term E because that's already taken by event. So we're going to change this to entity and replace the occurrences. So this list will now currently include all hittable entities within 4 blocks of the player that aren't the player. Now we can enumerate based on those by typing for entity living base, entity out of targets, and then above that we're going to type targets.sort comparator, comparing int, entity, the arrow, and then we're going to cast this as entity living base because when you do a comparator, it's always seen as a generic object. So we're going to plug in entity, and then after those parentheses, we're going to type get distance to entity mc.thePlayer. Instead of comparing int, we're going to do comparing double, and then save. So now our targets list is sorted in one direction, and we'll have to find out later when we actually have it attack things which direction it's sorting. So it could be correct now by sorting the entities by closest to farthest away, but it could also be wrong, so we won't know until later. But at the moment, since we've done all that filtering and sorting, we don't actually need this for entity method. Instead, we can just type if targets.is empty or is not empty. Then we want to get the first one. So targets.get 0, which should be the closest if our sorting algorithm is in the right direction. And we're going to say entity living base, give it the name target, and set it equal. We can say mc.thePlayer.sendQ.add to sendQ new CO2 packet use entity. Import that, plug in the target, and then I think we're going to need an action. So action.attack. So what is going to happen now is 20 times a second, it's going to attack the closest entity. So we need to make sure that we are timing this. So we're going to create a new utility. And in fact, we haven't created any utilities yet. So we're going to create a new package called intent.util. And then in here, we're going to create a new class called timer. It needs one variable called public long last ms. We're going to create a method called public void reset, where last ms becomes equal to the current time millisecond. And we're also going to set it to that every time it's instantiated as an object. So the next method we're going to create is called public boolean has time elapsed. And this is going to have 2 arguments. One is going to be the time, and the other is going to be a boolean called reset. And this is whether it automatically resets every time it's hit the time limit. So we're going to say if system.currentTime minus last ms is greater than time, we're going to return true. Otherwise, we're going to return false. But instead of just returning true, we're going to say if reset is true, then we're going to, and I can actually not use those brackets because those braces because Java is a flexible language. So immediately under the if statement, I can execute one thing that will be conditional based on the above if statement. But if I try to do 2 things, it wouldn't be. So if I did reset and then under it, I did reset again, it would always do this reset instead of only if reset is true. So then erase that and save. So now every time it hits the limit, it'll reset, but also still return true. So I can close that and go back to KillAura and create a new object called public timer equals new timer. I can import it from intent.util, and then I'll say over here, if timer.has time elapsed 1000 divided by 10. So this will be our CPS value of 10. True, we do want to reset every time it hits that, then attack. And if I save this, I go to run the client, I bring in a new mob and I turn it on, I'm attacking it until it's too far away. But if I get close, I'm attacking it. Now what you notice is that I'm not swinging my hand. So I need to type mc.thePlayer.swing item. And if I save that, I'll be swinging. So that's a basic KillAura. it'll be attacking all entities other than yourself, which you might not want. So that's where we're going to filter it down to whether we want it to only attack hostile mobs or friendly mobs or just players. And we also want to make it rotate the head server side to where we're looking. So it's, if a sheep is over here, it'll attack, and then when it's not attacking, it'll rotate back to where you were looking, but you won't see any of this happen because it'll all be server side. So to filter it to only players, we can type, and I'm going to actually silence the game. We can type targets equals targets stream filter entity player dot class colon is instance collect collectors to list, and save. And now it will only attack players. So if I turn it on, nothing happens. It's not attacking the sheep. If there were players, it would attack them, but we don't have any. So I'm going to say if entity animal save, it'll only attack sheep. And if I were to spawn in something like a creeper, it wouldn't attack the creeper, but it would attack the sheep. But in this case, I'm going to leave it unfiltered, and it's up to you what you want to filter it by. So in this case, it'll attack sheep, it'll attack creepers, whatever. So now we can test our theory to see if our sorting algorithm was in the right direction. I'm going to place a row of sheep here and see which ones it attacks. And yes, it's the right direction. It's attacking the closest first and then the farthest. Now we need to make the KillAura rotate server side so that we don't flag for not looking at the entity. So what we'll do is we'll create a new method called public float array get rotations. And then in the input, we'll put in an entity. So first we want to collect the deltas in our positions. So we can do that by typing float delta x equals e dot pos x plus e dot pos x minus e dot last tick pos x minus mc dot the player dot pos x. And what this will do is it'll give us the difference between the player position interpolating between the last tick and the current tick. So we'll need to actually convert this to a double and create a variable called delta y, set it equal to e dot pos y minus 3.5 plus e dot get I height minus mc dot the player dot pos y plus mc dot the player get I height. And the same for z that we did x. So e dot pos z plus e dot pos z minus e dot last tick pos z minus mc dot the player dot pos z, and terminate because we've made some changes that can't be loaded in the hot code, as well as the distance, which is as simple as math dot square root math dot power delta x to the second power plus math dot power delta z to the second power. Next, we'll create our float variables for yaw, which is simply math dot 2 degrees negative math dot arctangent delta x minus delta z comma pitch equals, and we need to cast this as float, negative math 2 degrees math arctangent delta y divided by distance. And we also need to cast this as float. Now we need to say for some special cases, because angles are a little bit weird, and if you go like 90 degrees one way, it can cause the KillAura to just go the opposite direction and that type of thing. So we're gonna say if delta x is less than 0 and delta z is less than 0, then we want to basically restate this a little bit differently. So we're gonna say yaw equals that, but we're going to remove the negative, swap the z and the x, and we also need to switch these to division, I forgot, and add 90 and put this in parentheses. And we'll also say if the x is greater than 0 and the z is less than 0, then we're going to also take this statement, but we're going to switch the 90 to a negative 90. And then we can just return a new float array with the yaw and pitch served up as contents to the array. Now, if we go back here to where the target is pulled out of the list, we're going to create actually a new EventMotion, but we're going to cast the existing event to an EventMotion like so. Then we can say event.setYaw equal to get rotations target, get the first one out of the array, so 0, which is yaw, and then do the same for pitch, but get the first, which is really the second index of the array. So now if I open the client server side, when I'm attacking, my head is actually looking over there. And we can prove this by, instead of setting the event, we can set our own rotation yaw equal to that, and our rotation pitch equal to that. And now if I attack, as you can see, I'm looking at the sheep, whichever one I'm attacking. It's a little bit jittery client side, but server side it's not as bad. And then there's also one more thing we can do. After I roll this back to the server side rotations, we can also say over here where we filter out the distance and those type of things, we can say we want to make sure that the entity is not dead and that the entity.getHealth is greater than 0. So now when I attack a sheep and I kill it, it'll immediately stop attacking instead of continuing to beat the dead body. This concludes part 5 of the How to Code a Hacked Client tutorial, and I will see you next time.
Bye.